Well, good evening, and thank you for coming to this event. I think it's going to be one of the most exciting and unexpected events in this festival. And welcome to the Bristol Festival of the Future City, which is part of the ongoing Bristol Festival Ideas. In particular, I've been asked to also thank our co-sponsors here, which is the Arts Council England, Innovate UK, Bristol City Council and the University of the West of England. And if you want to tweet, please use the hashtag FutureCities15. So this evening, we're going to think about the city in different ways. Over the course of the last few days, there have been a number of different approaches thinking about not only the cities that we live in, but the ones that we're going to build. And here we're going to look at how to explore these cities and what those explorations teach us. So we're going to start off with Bradley Garrett, who's going to tell us a little bit about place hacking the city. Bradley is a senior lecturer at Southampton University. Is that right? Yes.
Yeah.
Good. He's the author of, amongst other things, Explore Everything, Place Hacking the City, Subterranean London, and the forthcoming London Rising. He contributes often to The Guardian, this morning, for example, telling a story about climbing up cranes. He's a place hacker, which he'll explain later, interested in uncovering hidden places. And through this practice, as well as what he writes as a result of that, and reports back, is a manifesto that combines philosophy, politics, and adventure. This gets to the heart of the idea of the right to the city. Anna Minton, who's here on my right, is a researcher and a policy thinker. Between 2011 and 14, she was the 1851 Royal Commission for the Great Exhibition Fellow in the Built Environment. Quite a title. Pretty good. She's a journalist who's written The Guardian, FT, Architectural Review, and since this autumn has been the co-director of Reading the Neoliberal City, a new master's course at the University of East London. She's also the author of some of the most important, I think, sort of papers looking at the question of privatised public space, which will be one of the themes that we look at. In particular, Fortress Britain, which she wrote for the New Economics Foundation, Common Goods, which was written with the Arts Council in combination with the Chislehurst Gallery, and her book Common Ground, which was first published in 2009, and then with... Ground Control, which was then reissued with an extra chapter on the Olympics in 2012. So, Brad, do you want to start off telling us a little bit about place hacking?
Sure thing. Before I get started, I actually just wanted to say that I canceled some teaching yesterday so that I could spend 2 days at this festival, and it's been fantastic. I've had such a good time here, and it, going to interesting sessions was part of it, but it's also been about the conversations that I've had with many of you walking around this festival. It's been really enlightening, and I appreciate that. I'm also particularly grateful that you're here instead of seeing High Rise. I know that was quite a lure, so thanks for being here right now. So I began this PhD project in 2008 that took seriously the notion of trespass as a practice that had political potential to begin rethinking the terms in which we engage with the neoliberal city. Over about 5 years of PhD research, I worked with about 100 urban explorers, trespassing into sites in 8 different countries. We snuck into about 300 locations. And a lot of those explorations were about capturing photos of these places that are off limits to us under normal circumstances. Those photos, I think, had a political potential that was not even clear to me at the time that we were collecting them. They sort of took on a life of their own as we released them into the world, and that's part of what I want to talk about today. But I also want to say that, obviously as an intellectual project, I was sort of laying a framework for thinking through what we were doing, because this wasn't my practice, right? I was an ethnographer who embedded myself with urban explorers who had been doing this long before I arrived on the scene. But my job as a researcher was to take this practice, this totally fascinating practice, and to connect it to a body of literature. One of the things I read for that, obviously, was Ground Control. And it was foundational for me in thinking about the ways in which taking photos of the hidden city was actually getting behind that kind of security apparatus, and in some ways disarming it, which I think was quite important. But in 2013, after finishing my PhD, I got an email from Leo asking me if I would be interested in turning my PhD into a book. So it's quite a privilege to be here with both of them 7 years on from this project, sort of closing the loop. But I think, the lasting power of place hacking as a notion is not really about my work. It's about the political potential of the praxis and the way in which it's been taken up in all sorts of different forms. And I'm quite pleased to see how many people have sort of taken the concept and remixed it in various ways. So place hacking takes the notion of hacking back to its original roots, which come out of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And the word hacking, people forget this, it was actually applied to physical space before it was applied to virtual space. Hacking used to be about picking the locks on the steam tunnels underneath the campus to get unseen views, normally unseen views. And it was also about climbing onto the roof of the campus to get unique vantage points down on the campus. Now, the idea there was that hacking was about finding a limitation and then finding a creative way to circumvent that limitation. So the reason why they would pick the locks and not just crowbar the door open is because that's inelegant, right? In the same way that if we think about hacking a virtual system, a direct denial of service attack that just floods a server, it's seen as an inelegant hack, right? An elegant hacker will sort of wiggle their way behind the scenes of the operating system and expose the wiring. So I was quite excited to find when I started working on this project that there was a history of hacking, a lineage there, that we were actually taking it back to those original roots in a way. That was quite enticing. Cities, like many places on the internet, have been rendered sites of spectatorship. They've been rendered passive. Cities have become something for us to look at rather than something to participate in. And if we think about the spaces of the internet that are, again, very much about consumption, they're very much about passive consumption, very often they're about a consumer engagement, it takes a lot of work to kind of get behind those scenes, right? To understand, what is the fabric? What are the threads connecting all of this stuff? How do we expose the wiring, right? It's the same kind of work that we're doing with place hacking. And online, just as in cities, access is often granted based on wealth or status, or impeded largely based on largely facetious security narratives. So as place hackers, we find abstract theorization and philosophizing about the situation as simply a starting point, right? Place hacking is about the praxis. It's about the melding of the theory and the practice. It's about going out and actually undertaking explorations which are going to change your perception of the city, and by releasing these photos, hopefully begin to influence other people's perceptions of the city, right? Quite literally, screwing with your notions of thinking about what is possible, right? This stuff is not supposed to be possible. So you can see where the political potential lies in releasing these photographs, right? Over the past 7 years, we've carved ourselves, our bodies, our desires, into the narratives of the city in an attempt to sort of rewrite that code. And there's nothing malicious in this stance, nor should it be moralized. It's simply how we experience place as an invitation to participation. And for some of us, and I'm thinking here of Ian Sinclair, who gave a great talk last night about the political potential of walking, pulling back the curtain for him is about walking the streets, talking to people, observing daily life, drifting, scavenging, pontificating, and then of course sharing it all. That's the clincher, right? That's the important part. So if we don't bring back the stories and share it with people, what have we done? It's largely a selfish endeavor. So that's the point of the photography, to share these stories. Some of you may remember in 2010, we climbed the Shard before it was completed. And we leaked some of the first photos from the top of the building that anyone had seen. And to our surprise at the time, the reaction from the public, from the media, from the developer, and even from the architect, Renzo Piano, was largely positive. We were expecting that the hammer was going to come down when those photos got released and started flying all over the internet and ending up in newspapers in the country. But I think that the story of that infiltration, along with the much more daring ascent of the building by 6 female Greenpeace protesters in 2014, now that was a proper ascent. And also that story of the fox that was living off of this it was scavenging off of the remains of, right? These become the cultural threads of the building. This is what gives the building life. Because as expected, since the completion of the tower, it's become, a largely unoccupied, hermetically sealed box that has almost no relationship to the community at its base, and has become the domain of speculative investment. This is a story we've heard again and again at this conference. This is a space that offers 17-pound yoga classes followed by 21-pound cocktails with tall-sounding names. And before any of that stuff happened, we were up there with stolen tins of beer, seeing the view for free. Right? We expected there was going to be a negative reaction from this, but actually, everyone was interested in the fact that we could get away with it, and the developers, I think slightly to our dismay, saw it as an opportunity to promote the view of the building. Right? So, on more than one occasion, I've been contacted by developers asking to use my photography in their ads, which I haven't agreed to. For obvious reasons. So while our experiences climbing and tunneling into the corporate city have made us acutely aware of the social stratification inherent in these new builds and private infrastructures, they're also celebratory of investment and iconic starchitecture, as we like to call it. Place hackers, because we disregard social expectations and legal frameworks, thrive in a city of change. Like everyone who cares about the city, we're at times nostalgic when something disappears, but we become strange bedfellows of architects because we inject verve into their hallucinations, right? These buildings don't actually consist of anything. They're not threaded into the cultural narratives of the city until we do that work. If our goal in undertaking a comprehensive, unsolicited survey of the neoliberal city over the past 7 years has been to inspire the imagination, we see the many subsequent appropriations of our aesthetic as a sure sign of our success. So although it's frustrating that place hacking is now ending up in sort of shoe ads and being used in ways in which we never intended, this is what happens. As the anthropologist Marc Auger, who keeps coming up in this conference again, Marc Auger has written that the true dilemma facing all artists and activists is the extreme flexibility of capitalism, which will gobble up any attempt at a unique branch of activism or thought. And we knew that from the beginning. We knew that this was inevitable, that urban exploration would be co-opted. And that, to us, was more dangerous than any authoritarian crackdown that we ever faced. The law was not the problem. Corporations were the problem. However, I feel like a lot of the abstract cynicism and negativity from the political left is really a limp weapon when wielded against global forces of neoliberal capitalism. What we need and what place hacking offers, rather than just condemning the way that everything operates, is an alternative model for action. Right? Place hacking doesn't offer abstract speculation. It offers a practice that we can use. Those of us with critical proclivities that are inspired to kind of dig into every urban issue, like investigative journalists, or man the barricades as social housing is ripped down in the city. We all understand that the system is breaking us. However, I think that we have to beware of falling into the trap of simply condemning the system, because when we condemn the system, we reinforce its power. Right? Place hacking recognizes that the system exists and dismisses it. We do what we like, regardless of what system is in place. And actually, the larger politics behind how the city is being governed and built, they don't matter, because we'll still get away with what we're doing. We get away with it in Dubai, we get away with it in Cambodia, we get away with it in Los Angeles. This can be done everywhere. Perhaps one day we won't be able to get away with it, but until then, we should carry on. Acceptance and passivity are not the only options. The third option here is the hack, which takes the system as it is, slips under the net behind the operating system, and rewrites the rules. In other words, the best way to disarm a law is simply to ignore it. In the United States, there's this notion called jury nullification, which occurs when there's a trial and the jury is absolutely sure that the person on trial is guilty of the crime, but the jury doesn't believe that the law is just. And so they're rendered not guilty through a jury nullification. Imagine a city where the hack is a collective nullification of laws and social expectations that are constraining us, that are stopping us from building the city that we want to live in. At one end of the scale, perhaps, if everyone starts drinking alcohol in the tube again, at some point the system will just crack. It will just give up. That law will have no effect because everyone just does it anyway. And you see this in Paris, right? Like half the people don't pay for their metro ticket. They're sliding under, they're jumping over. At some point, the system carries on. You can't arrest everyone, right? And on the other end of the scale, perhaps we can think about Snowden, right? Who committed an extreme criminal act to stop a greater crime from happening. So here again is the intersection between hacking and place hacking, right? Is that if we just ignore laws that are immoral or unjust, and we carry on living in the city and creating the world that we want to see, there's a strong political potential there that doesn't require grassroots activism, and it doesn't require a top-down approach. All it requires is following your own lines of desire. So if hacking is a constant arms race between those with the knowledge and power to erect barriers and those with the equal knowledge, power, and especially desire to disarm them, then let me be clear when I say that place hacking is dead for now. It did its work. We had a good run. We started some really interesting conversations, but it has been gobbled up now. The aesthetic has been appropriated. Things are starting to get really messy. There was 2 weeks ago, you probably saw this in the news, there was a 17-year-old Russian kid that was hanging off the side of a building, taking a selfie to put on Instagram. His rope snapped and he died. This is happening more and more now because people who are getting involved with the practice are getting involved for the wrong reasons. They're getting involved because they want fame. They're not getting involved because of the politics behind the practice. They're not getting involved because they want to reveal these power structures or undermine these power structures. They're getting involved to reinforce them through a celebration of all the things that we've been trying to bypass over these years. So what we've moved on to, I can't really tell you yet. We've been very busy over the past couple of months, and we're going to be very busy over the summer. But I would like to invite you, as we did with place hacking, to participate in what comes next. You'll see it when it happens. I hope you'll be interested in it, and I hope that you'll consider joining in. Because if we have any chance of competing with neoliberal ideologies, I think that we've got to start building this world that we want to see. And we need to start building from a place of positivity rather than just whinging about the system that we're not happy with. The world is not static. It's never been. And the more it's engineered to exclude us, the more that over-engineering will reveal gaps and cracks that we can take pry bars to, literally and metaphorically. The solution to this situation does not lie in the passage of new laws or the pseudoscience of creative metrics or in technological utopianism. or in attracting investment, but in the creation of different situations, right? We need to create situations that are more appealing than the situation we're in right now. That's how we're going to win this battle. The cultural future of the city literally rests on how we spend our free time, or what little free time we have left. You know, are we going to sit in front of screens and be distracted? Are we going to give people our money to distract us? Or are we going to use our weekends to go out and do something, to get involved with the city? That is literally what our future rests on, that decision. So think about that the next time you queue up something on Netflix, right? There are more important things to be done in the world right now. That choice, regardless of what the city looks like around you, is always yours. Participation can be an ontological position. So I think it's important that this conversation is actually happening in Bristol, because Bristol has for a long time been a bastion of edginess, as I heard someone say the other day. But that's changing, isn't it? Millennium Square, as far as I know, is privately owned. That's your city disappearing. Cabot Circus, privately owned. That's your city disappearing. It's starting to look like a shopping mall. I hate to break it to you.
Thank you. Right. Anna, can I ask you to respond to Brad and then open up the discussion?
I'm going to respond to what Brad has outlined by providing a context for this increasingly privatised neoliberal city that Brad has place-hacked so effectively in recent years. And he ended, I felt, on a slightly cryptic note, talking about what he's been thinking about recently. I hope that you'll participate. And I hope that by the time I reach the end of my comments, that might be a little bit clearer. But first of all, I'm just going to sketch what we mean, what I mean, really, when I've talked about this increasingly privatised city. And the context for that is the post-industrial landscape, the docksides here, the city centres, which used to be factories, warehouses, canal sides, old mill buildings, which have all been regenerated, to use that word of the last 15 years or so, regeneration. What actually is regeneration? It's this sort of development, this post-industrial development, which actually has created this privatised city, and it's privatised on a number of key levels. The privatisation of public space, that's very much at the centre of what I talked about in ground control. But equally, you've got the privatisation of housing, the death, the slow death, now accelerated death of social and affordable housing. And Brad talked about the city as increasingly a place of spectacle and passivity. Well, the creation of this city of consumption and spectacle. And this two-speed economy, which really was a creation of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, was always justified by the idea of trickle-down, bring lots of wealth into a city and trickle down to benefit the poorest parts of the city, which need it the most. And actually, I think that's it's clear that that just simply isn't the case. It's a complete fallacy. And what you end up with is this very divided, segregated, high-security city, which is a much more fearful and distrustful place. So that's the overall context. I'm aware I haven't got too much time, so I'm going to sort of zip through things a little bit. That was the context when I was writing Ground Control, which was 2006, 2007. Then the crash happened, and that actually seemed to be sort of creating a sort of space and a pause. And actually I ended Ground Control on this quite positive note, thinking that, you know, this model surely now is defunct. You know, it's based on boom and bust. It's based on really high property and land values. You know, it's led to this really divided environment. Now things are going to be done differently. But I was wrong. And not only was I wrong, I was like super wrong, because post-crash, you know, I think we've seen, well, post the last few years, we've seen neoliberalism really off the leash completely. And we've seen this sort of hyper-gentrification and hyper-speculation as billionaire investors have piled into London, they've piled into the southeast, they've piled into all of the UK's hotspots. And this picture of division and segregation, actually in London particularly, has become really, really extreme, where you've got 230 towers going up across London, all of which will be creating these privately owned spaces that I'll talk to you a bit more about in a minute. At the same time, you've got up to 90 estates, housing estates, for people on low incomes, and even ordinary incomes, to be honest, because the situation in London is now so unaffordable, coming down. You've got those people being forcibly removed from their homes. You've had the definition of affordable housing actually changed by the government to now mean up to 80% of market rent, which, when you see the prices in London, which are just so astronomically high in central London, you know, is out of reach of people on not low incomes, but on ordinary average incomes. So things have really, really become a lot more extreme. But just to explain what the privatised city really means, I'll take you back to when I saw it really starting off in the UK. And this slide is the centre of Liverpool in about 2006-07, I think. And this was to become Liverpool 1, which is 34 streets in the heart of Liverpool, all of which are now privately owned, privately controlled, their own private security services, CCTV everywhere, quite severe restrictions on rules and regulations, what you can and can't do, a very different idea of the city. This is a completely different place. It's a little place just round the corner from Victoria Station, which is called Cardinal Place. And I include this one here just to show you that whether or not it's large scale or small scale, this actually became the template for all new development, absolutely everywhere in the UK. This became the way we did things, and it is still now the way we do things. And it's a template which really has got its foundations in Canary Wharf and the Broadgate Centre, these finance centres created in the 80s to meet the needs of finance as a result of Big Bang, which created the need for these huge banks, of the deregulated finance industry with their massive trading floors, and they pioneered this model. And now this model, which was pioneered there, has spread out to cover every new development in our towns and cities. And I think Brad said how here in Liverpool you are increasingly subject to these pressures, and that is indeed my next slide, which you'll recognise as Cabot Circus, which is another Liverpool 1 type development here in Bristol. And what really seems to characterise these places for me is that no matter where you are, there's nothing about Cabot Circus which tells you that you're in Bristol. There's nothing about Liverpool 1 which tells you that you're in Liverpool. So actually you can drive in, I think, on the M32 to Cabot Circus, straight in on the motorway, straight into Bristol, straight into the underground car park, come up, spend the day shopping, going to the cinema, having a meal, go back into the car park, into your car, and out again, and you would never know that you were in Bristol. And actually, that is how these places have been designed, as engines of economic growth for the region and for the country. GDP is what they're all about. They are not about knitting together the urban fabric, creating places which serve the community. They're much more about actually transnational points on a sort of global on a global route map almost. You know, these places resemble nothing more than airport departure lounges in many ways. And they all look the same. And actually, well, Lefebvre, the French Marxist sociologist and philosopher, predicted more than 40 years ago now that if you treat place purely as a product, everywhere would come to look the same. And this is exactly what we've seen happen. But it's not just the privatised spaces in the city. Actually, this whole model is spreading out into the whole city itself. And we're creating this city of consumption and spectacle, of mega events, expos, visitor attractions. I live in London. I have small children. We have these amazing attractions in London, which, to be honest, you can't have a day out in London with the kids for less than 150 quid. I mean, how can people afford to do this? Well, of course they can't. You know, most ordinary Londoners can't afford to do it. It's a city for the global, the well-heeled global visitor, and it's a city for the billionaire global investor. So it's a complete re-imaging of the city. Just to go back to the private places, though, which really are the sort of at the epicenter of these of undemocratic space. Private security guards, defensible architecture, lots of rules and regulations, no photographs, skateboarding, cycling, even eating or drinking in some places, and absolutely critical, no political demonstrations. You're not allowed to protest politically here. These are not democratic spaces. I'm running out of time here, so I want to get everything in. I'll just quickly zip to this, because this was Occupy in 2011. Why was Occupy here? Well, they were supposed to be here, which is Paternoster Square, just behind St Paul's Cathedral, and they were actually called Occupy London Stock Exchange, and they wanted to protest outside the Stock Exchange, but because it's a privately owned space, they weren't able to, and they immediately ejected. A court injunction was imposed upon them, and they ended up here. So what actually emerged is that the whole square mile of the City of London is now a series of these privately owned estates. And actually this pattern, which began in the late 80s in Canary Wharf and Broadgate, now has taken over the whole of the city. It's all privately owned, apart from this space outside St Paul's Cathedral and a small space outside the Bank of England, which is equally a focus for protests. And apart from that, the whole City of London is an undemocratic space, which, to be honest, very accurately reflects the democratic processes of the City of London Corporation itself. I just want to talk to you a little bit about this slide, because people often say to me, well, look, isn't this how the great estates were built? You know, the Georgian squares and terraces of the finest parts of London and cities like Bristol and Liverpool. And, you know, they were built by one individual aristocratic landlord who owned the estate. And, you know, this is a sound model for development. But actually, this is Bedford Square in London, built by the Duke of Bedford. And what you don't see here is that this was surrounded by high fences and gates and sentry boxes. And actually, the public weren't allowed in. And as local government and local democracy grew in power, there were huge public protests, which were reflected in a parliamentary inquiry in the mid-19th century, and then finally an Act of Parliament, which ruled that these private places had to open their streets and public places, and to use the jargon, streets and public places had to be adopted. And that means that they were public. And so we've had this notion that, of course, the streets will stay public. They always have been. Well, they haven't always been. This was a hard-won democratic achievement, and what you're seeing now is that this democratic achievement is going into reverse. This privatised city, I mean, this is the kind of ultimate sort of folly of London at the moment. You, I'm sure, have heard of the Garden Bridge. It is not to be a public highway, a public right-of-way. It will be a privatised bridge. Groups of more than, is it 6 or 8 people aren't allowed? You have to, yeah, no more, so groups of more than 8 people aren't allowed.
But you have to get a permit for groups.
Right, you need a permit, no cycling over the bridge. I think your mobile phone signal will be tracked when you're going over the bridge. Of course, no political demonstrations or anything like that. And this is the city, really, that we're creating now in London. And for anyone who says that Boris Johnson doesn't really do anything, actually, I think he's done an awful lot. He's really transformed what London is all about during his time as Mayor of London. So if you want any indication of what he might be like as Prime Minister. Okay, so just to come back to what Brad was saying, well, you know, he ended his talk on quite sort of depressing note in some ways. I felt, you know, place hacking is dead. You know, that's over. The forces of reaction have defeated place hacking. They've co-opted it. It's all part of, you know, glossy advertising images, and kids are taking it up for all sorts of nefarious reasons. I just want to end on a sort of, unusually for me, slightly more positive note, that despite all the sort of dreadful things that are happening at the moment with austerity and the housing crisis and the cuts, we do have much more evidence of a social movement building, not just here, in Spain, in Greece, in Scotland, Jeremy Corbyn, the Green Party. The housing crisis in London has really galvanised people, and I know that you've got a really lively scene sort of mobilised sort of and engaged with issues around change and gentrification in Bristol as well. I don't know if this is what Brad was referring to when he was talking about, slightly cryptically, about what he's been thinking about over the summer, but Brad and I have discussed together that we really want to try and create a sort of movement to open up public space again and to raise these issues and to kind of create a sort of Kinder Scout movement to reclaim private space in cities. And we're working out how to do this. You know, we're both part of academic institutions, we're both journalists. We hope to sort of put something together. We're not quite sure how we're going to do it yet, but a mixture of mapping the city to show actually what has moved into private hands, where space is no longer democratic, combined with events where people will just go into these spaces and do whatever they want in them. So, you know, I think that's what you meant, but, you know, hopefully that could give us, you know, all of us who are interested in these things, something to sort of coalesce around. But on the whole, the picture's pretty negative.
So it's not all grim, but it is rather grim. I mean, if I quickly could sort of make a very, very sort of, I suppose, very quick point about this privatised public space, which is something that I also feel incredibly passionate about. I sometimes have, in some ways, something like a nightmare in which I feel that moment and that spirit that I feel when I think about the sort of values of public space, that's a false memory. That, you know, it's something that was occurred in the 1920s and ended in the 1980s, and actually the history of it is so short that it's almost like a blip on the landscape, and actually we're just going back to the status quo, which is not necessarily a status quo that I would readily accept, and so that's why I value so much things like place hacking, which reminds you of those boundaries. It makes the invisible visible again. One of the things that I've been looking at recently, which complicates this whole idea of, you know, the financialization of our cities, that, you know, it becomes very difficult to keep a place public if it has a price. And if you can put a price on it, then someone somewhere can buy it. And I've been looking at some places in London, and what fascinates me is that one of the really large financial backers to some of these big schemes that, you know, most normal people would think were sort of shocking additions to the skyline, really are being funded by things like the teachers' pension fund in Canada. So there are, you know, teachers who are probably, you know, working on NIMBY campaigns, or, you know, looking at First People sort of campaigns in Ottawa or Vancouver, whose money is actually going to build these atrocious new things on South London. And yet the connection, because it's the globalised financial market, that you can't connect those two things up. And I think that's sort of part of the problem. I mean, I don't know whether you want to sort of jump in on that.
Well, I mean, I think the whole sort of transnational movement of big capital into property investment markets in the UK in particular is a massive part of this problem. And I was actually in a session on the housing crisis this afternoon where Michael Edwards showed this amazing slide of overseas investment in not just residential property, but commercial property as well in the UK compared to the rest of the world. And it was quite astonishing, wasn't it? I mean, you were there too.
Yeah.
You know, the UK bar was like all the way out here, and then all the other countries in the world were sort of, you know, and were far, far less. And actually, Germany, Switzerland, and Japan, you know, 3 countries which we consider to be economically, you know, financially very sound, were right at the bottom of that graph. So it was quite an astonishing. Yeah. So I mean, I think you're absolutely right. The links need to be made, but the key thing is that our government just has a one-track policy of saying, let's just suck in all that money. We don't actually care if it comes from the Toronto Teachers Fund or if it comes from dodgy Russian money. You know, we just want it here. And that's a very problematic place to be.
It is, and the other thing I think it's important to keep in mind and keep bringing to the fore is the idea that these austerity measures are forcing the privatization of space, and that's intentional, right? The more you cut budgets to the council, the more they're going to have to sell off land to just, you know, to meet the bottom line. So it's not, you know, blaming the council, like the council is at fault in some ways, but it's actually, you know, very often they're the victims too, you know, of these incredible policies that are being put in place specifically to give away that land to private interests. And if I were to push that a little bit further, in many cases I think that's happening so that it can be governed under the laws of private companies, which are probably, you know, agreed in back rooms somewhere to limit democratic activities from taking place in these spaces. And you know, I'm not sure what we can do about that, but you know, what we can do is we can do this. We can raise awareness on it. We can create infographics. We can place hack stuff. We can try and make it visible. But at some point, you know, we're gonna have to take action. And that's.
But I mean, I think that's what's really difficult. It's really difficult to know how much of this is sort of planned, you know, conspiracy, and how much is just chaotic.
Yeah.
And actually, I think it's surprising exactly how much is chaotic and how much is unintended consequences. Yeah. And, you know, an awful lot of, you know, probably Tory politicians don't want the streets to be entirely privately owned. But they just haven't worked all of this through because they're so hampered by their ideology.
You know, we talk about the privatisation of public space, but what do we lose when we lose public space? What is the value of public space to the city or to the people? One of the sort of questions that I've been asking continuously over the last few years is, who is the city for? And I think this is something that public space really responds to. And when we sort of see there's sort of increasingly amounts of hidden rules about who is allowed to be in and what one is allowed to do, I think that becomes an incredible problem, as you were saying in Liverpool 1 and possibly in Cabot Square, but in very places, a number of places, these rules and these decisions on who is this part of the city for, I think are absolutely essential. But in terms of your practice, in terms of finding those, I suppose, those borders and those frontiers, did you come across them more and more as you were going around?
Well, yeah, I wasn't, when I began this project, I wasn't really aware of any of these things, and part of building that awareness was reading work like Anna's, and part of it was actually just trespassing, crossing the boundary, because suddenly, you know, when you cross the boundary and you try and do something, suddenly the security apparatus springs to life, and then you realize, oh, there's a camera there and someone's watching it, or the security guard's now going to accost me because I've tried to take a photograph or whatever. And so it's, you know, a lot of these boundaries that are regulating our behaviors all the time, they're invisible. And in order to make them visible, sometimes we have to cross them. I mean, some of my favorite work is Charlie Veitch, from the Love Police. I don't know if you've ever seen him. He sort of walks around with a bullhorn in various spaces to see what kind of response he can get. And he's gone into Canary Wharf, for instance, and he gets, you know, these huge crowds gathering around. And then security guards tell him to leave because he's protesting. And he says, I'm not protesting, I'm just speaking through a bullhorn. You know? But in doing that, the security apparatus springs to life, and you suddenly realize what you can't do. that if you were to try and stage a protest there, that would be a serious problem, because you're on private land.
Oh, hello, they're coming through. But now we've got a few minutes which I'd like to open up to the audience here.
I'm just quite interested in how, and I thought this when I saw you earlier today, and I wanted to ask the question, but there wasn't time. What's the mechanism that turns public space into private space? Because Paternoster Square presumably used to be public space, and now it isn't. I don't understand quite what's happened to make it private space.
Well, the problem with all of this is that the mechanisms are massively obscure and completely impenetrable to people. You know, it's like the mechanism, one of the key mechanisms, I think, and this is only because I have researched this, because I had to do so, but one of the mechanisms is stopping up orders. So the local authority can apply for stopping up orders to close off a public right-of-way, which has been there for generations, perhaps centuries, and therefore it can become private space. That is one mechanism. How would you ever know about it? Does anyone tell you? Is the local authority going to tell you when they advertise their wonderful new waterfront development? No, of course they're not. That's one mechanism. Another mechanism is compulsory purchase powers. So the way that these huge sites like Cabot Circus and Liverpool One are assembled is through compulsory purchase, enabling these very, very large sites to be created. And as the planning system has been systematically deregulated and much more geared around economic regeneration objectives rather than the public good of the city, it's much easier through planning legislation to put this sort of site together now. So it's all there in the detail of really obscure planning and highways legislation. But, you know, who would ever know that?
And you I think it's the Planning Act of 92 or something that...
I mean, there are so many planning acts which... what specifically
That's from
were
the
you...
Uncommon
the Common Good report.
Yeah.
Oh, golly, you know, Leah, you are testing me now.
Okay. Brad, do you want to talk about public space protection orders?
That's exactly where I was going. So the one thing to add here is that last year, a new act came into force, the criminal... I've forgotten the name of the act now.
It was part of a
Crime and Policing Act.
Yeah.
Anyway, so there's a new kind of order that's come into effect called public space protection orders, which allow the council to sort of map out an area on a city or multiple areas in which they can criminalize normally non-criminal activities. So in the same way that you could pass ASBOs previously against particular individuals for something like spitting on the sidewalk, you could make that criminal, right? They can now do that for an entire mapped area on the city. And they've been rolling these out all over the country over the past year to criminalize things like driving loud cars, walking dogs without leads, sleeping rough, busking, begging. So there was one in Hackney that was actually defeated, or at least the terms were varied because of public protest that was going to outlaw rough sleeping in Hackney. And you can imagine the effects of that on vulnerable homeless populations.
Excellent. Brad, should we get some more questions?
This might be completely wrong, but I believe in Hong Kong there's a certain law in place that says that for a new development of a certain size, there has to be a certain amount of public space as a part of the development. So the roof of the IFC Mall, for example, there's a big public space you can go without any restriction. My question based on that is, do you know of any cities who are dealing with this challenge in a novel, interesting way that you think could be applied elsewhere?
I think the problem with a lot of those laws is that when a public space is connected to a development, it often ends up being owned by the developer. And so then you end up with another private space. And so very often a public space will be annihilated to build a new development, and when it gets rebuilt, you've essentially lost the public space. That's one of the ways that it slips into private hands.
I mean, I just sort of follow up on that to say that, I mean, I don't know Hong Kong terribly well, but I imagine that the public space you're referring to is not what I would call public. It might be public, but all the rules and regulations of a Paternoster Square or a Canary Wharf will be in place.
It's like the garden at the top of the walkie-talkie is supposedly public space, but you need to get a ticket to go there, and then you probably have to spend £10 on a coffee. Can we take the next question?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of share a thought more than ask a question, I guess. I'm a local councillor. I'm in the Green Party. I'm on a planning committee. I'm trying to resist things like, like the privatisation of the middle of the city centre. But more and more, there are things that are coming to our planning committee, like building loads and loads of student housing in the middle of the city, where it's increasingly difficult to actually resist those sort of things because of planning legislation, which means that you can only resist on X, Y, and Z, very, very small minutiae, and otherwise the council gets sued. And there's just this kind of onslaught of, you want to resist, but how do we actually resist? And the democratic right is being taken out from under the feet of our city, and that really distresses me. And the other thing I wanted to say was, in my ward just this week in Easton, there was a bunch of people who were squatting this really amazing building in the middle of, on the end of one of my roads, and they were inviting in loads of people in the local neighbourhood to start talking about how do we use this building in a better way, how can we have classes here and use it for a nursery and use the garden or whatever. And then they were taken to court this week and then evicted, and the bailiffs kind of came in the middle of the night. But it is a publicly owned building, so it's actually owned by the Ministry of Justice. But there's this thing also about publicly owned spaces, and even when something good is starting to happen within those things, central government is pushing out creativity from the way in which we're trying to reimagine our cities. But yeah.
Can I ask you to keep an eye on the public space protection order that's going into effect here in the next couple of months?
Yeah, well, I'd be really interested to find out a bit
we can
more
talk about that later.
Yeah.
Can you hear at the front?
It's not a defence of private space, but it's just a comment on it, I guess. When I go to Cabot Circus, sometimes I go there and I'll buy some clothes or something. And it's easy to buy stuff and there's no aggro or there's no confrontation. When I go to the Bear Pit in Stokescroft, I live near there, it's quite a kind of intimidating place to go. A lot of people are scared because there's lots of beggars and lots of people are drinking. And since it's had some regeneration or community money, hardly anything compared to what Cabot Circus had, it actually seems like it's become worse as a public space. It's actually just not working. So in this context, it's a 1960s development. It's a horrendous idea of how you should plan the city by sinking a roundabout and then walking through tiny spaces. But we've got them, we've been given them by previous generations, and that was what they thought would be good. But what do you do with that? Because that's an obvious target to kind of have these new development orders where the police are coming in and saying, look, all these people have to go. And I guess it's an issue with Stokescroft having so many wet clinics and so many 24-hour drinking areas, and all the people have been pushed to this area. But could private space be beneficial there, or is it just not? Because there's no money for the council to protect that area to make it safe for people to walk around. It kind of seems intimidating at night. So it's just a comment on that, really, in that private space be a positive thing?
Excellent. I mean, should we get some more questions
sure.
and then come back and answer those?
There's all talk about public spaces, but nothing about residential housing and the culture, how residential housing is built. Like in England now, it's the 64% of people own their houses, or well, there's huge mortgages probably, but they're not renting, they're owning. And everybody has their own kitchen and their living room, and it's like the private space is very private, and it's very kind of owned to tiny cells of tiny families.
I think that's a very interesting question. Should we move there to the next? Yep.
Can you create the change by working within these, by working with the land developers and the landowners and the developers and the construction management companies? Is there a role of using the examples that you've made so far? Do you know? Is there a way to create change from changing thought within those organisations, or do you think it needs to continue independently of it?
Okay, thank you. So I think they're questions of co-production, shared space, and dealing with sort of social blight.
Can I tackle these two, and maybe you can get the first one. So I think in terms of organizing to work with urban planners, for instance, to try and get things in place. Sometimes that does work, but when it doesn't, my answer to that is we should just do it anyway. Because very often, if you just do what you want to do, you build the city you want to build, then that's a more powerful political statement than saying it, right? Then they can see it, they can see what you want, and then they have to sort of contend with it. And the follow-on from that is the kind of communal living that you're talking about is being driven out of the city, particularly through the criminalization of squatting. Squats were those places where I lived in a squat for many years when I was working, or for many months when I was working on my PhD. And, that was our communal space where our sort of private lives were on show. But the other thing that I want to say about that is that the public space also extends into private space. I mean, the pub as the public house is our gathering space, and that's a space of private business, right? So, we can't think of public space as being only something that's sort of outside and in a public square, right? It does extend beyond that.
But it's like the opening of a private space can start also in the spaces that we own. Our own homes and so on. That's changing culture.
Yeah. Well, that's what squats did, but, it's culture's being driven out.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just pick up on that before I come to your point. I mean, I think just as a sort of overview, Britain has a traditionally less developed sense of public space, both kind of within private space and sort of outside, than continental Europe, for example. My mum's Greek, so I grew up partly, spending summers in Greece. The culture of public space in Greece, where, everything is focused around the square, and the whole idea of privatizing, squares in the centre of Athens is just, Jesus, it will probably happen now.
Well, and when
they've
tried in Belgium, they've barricaded the squares in Belgium when they've tried.
So, there is that sort of at play as well. We don't have a tradition of homes with internal courtyards. So we have different sort of cultural traditions towards public and private space. But just to take your point, I think that's completely fine to like going shopping at Cabot Circus. And, of course it is. And that's absolutely your choice. And you just go straight there and buy some jeans and whatever. So my point isn't that I'm trying to critique people who buy stuff from Cabot Circus or other privatised places. What I'm trying to say is that I don't think that everywhere should be like that. And what I'm worried about is that this has been the model for development that we have rolled out, the only model of development that we pretty much rolled out over the last 15 years. So that's my main concern, that there's no diversity. On to Stokes Croft. As it happens, the last time I was in Bristol, I was in Stokes Croft. You were at my talk in the church. So that, I think I could only describe Stokes Croft as a contested space. And that was a hotly contested meeting. I mean, that was one of the best attended talks I've ever given. I don't normally talk to 200 people from a pulpit in a church. It's the first time it had ever happened.
You'll be fine.
Yeah, and it was a massively, massively engaged audience. And I do think that if you'd stood up and suggested that Stokes Croft was privatised, I would have been a bit worried about your safety.
I was saying the benefit.
So let me ask you this: where should antisocial behavior happen? Because it is going to happen. So where should it happen?
Well, I don't know. I'm not saying that it shouldn't. People who are in situations that are.
You see, the thing is,
shouldn't be moved away, but there should be support for them.
well, the antisocial behaviour isn't created by Stokes Croft.
No.
Stokes Croft is a place where a diversity of communities, including marginalised communities, probably because this is a part of the city where drop-in clinics, etc., are sort of able to be. It's a place where lots of different people rub up against each other. That doesn't, I think, create the behaviour, but also it's a community which has a history of protest, and it's got the People's Republic of Stokes Croft, it's got the history of the riot against Tesco's. There are a lot of people within Stokes Croft who would be incredibly resistant to the sort of privatisation and the kind of gating of the carriage works that we were discussing when I was there last time. You know, it is a contested territory. I happen to think, I don't know the Bear Pit, I don't know where you're referring to. I imagine it's a sort of a rough part of...
It's just on the pedestrian line, so you just, go Stokes Croft to the city centre.
Oh, so you're not talking about Stokes Croft, you're talking about that underpass.
Yeah, where
Okay,
there's the polar bear that looks like a zebra on top.
Well, I mean, I think that underpass is, yeah, I mean, that's clearly a really problematic area. And that's not about preserving Stokes Croft, and it's not about privatising Cabot Circus. I'd slightly misunderstood.
There's no money to actually make it work, so it's not really working. So how...
Well, yeah, I mean, there is. It's about having a sort of view of the city as a whole, and about kind of developing. What you get when you privatise different parts of the city is you get a privatised monolith like Cabot Circus, and it does not connect up with another area like Stokes Croft, which is like 5 minutes away. If you could look at the city as more of a sort of whole, which, I don't know, I'm sure George Ferguson would say he tries to do, you know, these sorts of problems should be joined up. But yes, that area clearly needs to be hugely dealt with. And I wouldn't say that privatising it needs to be the answer. I mean, yes, get rid of that underpass for starters, you know, but it's obviously too expensive, too problematic, nobody knows what to do with it.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to call this public meeting to an end. You can continue the conversation, but only if you buy Anna or Brad's book at the bookshop.
or a pint.
But thank you very much indeed, Brad and Anna, and thank you.
Thank you very much.